Hello and welcome to this video where we'll go into multiple containers and the data. We will go into how to work with something called Docker Compose and how that works in theory, and also Docker volumes. So we'll go into the keynote now, so see you there. So I'm here in Keynote now. Data and multiple containers are important when Dockerizing your entire application. So let's go here. So where's my data? You said Docker containers were great, so where's my data, dude? Yes, apparently it disappears after shutting down the container. Use me to pick the locks off the container and look inside the hood. Okay, fine, let's do that. So let's go inside of a Docker container. Inside of the Docker containers, we have several layers. This is the host system, and this is the Docker container. First of all, we have the base layer. When you're doing from something, you have from an image, right? This will install things. For example, from Python 3.11. Then I will install the Python image. This is the base layer. And then, for example, you do copy command and you do other instructions, for example, run, pip install, etc., and cmd for command. These are instruction layers, so basically instructions. These are intermediate layers together with, these are intermediate layers. All these here are read-only. We'll come back to that soon. Then you have a very, very thin container layer. And we'll see what this means now. This is basically your Docker container. It's several abstractions built on layers on top of each other. From the base layer, you have the operating system, you have, for example, Python that is installed. If you use the Python image, if you use another image, then you have, if you have Kafka image, then you will have Kafka installed and probably some Python distribution and also some other things that is required for that operating system, for Kafka. So some OS, for example, Linux. These are the read-only layers. So these are created from Docker file commands such as from, run, add, and copy. This one is a read-write, a very thin layer created on top of the other layers where data is written during the lifetime of the container. For example, you export a CSV file or you export a PNG, a graph, for example, using matplotlib, then it's stored there for the rest of the lifetime of the container, but the data doesn't persist when the container shuts down. So when the container shuts down, the data disappears. Okay, so how is that useful? How is that useful if it's disappear? Well, it's if you want to store data, then it's not useful to just have the container layer for writing the data. For example, you want to have a database that is persisted, or you want to persist files, then you should have something called volumes. There's something called volumes and bind mount to persist data. Here's the host system, and you have your Docker container. This is the host file system. So in your host system, you have the host file system and the Docker container. So the file system, basically where you store your files. And when you're doing bind mount, you can control directly where you should save it in your host file system. However, when you're using Docker volume, it's stored somewhere in the Docker area. So it means that there is some place in your host file system that is managed by Docker. And when it's managed by Docker, you don't need to be aware of it and shouldn't mess with it. Instead, Docker will save it in this area. So this is Docker volumes. There's a difference between when you want to persist data, you can use bind mount and you can use Docker volumes. So volumes, they are stored in certain place in host and managed by Docker. And bind mounts, they are stored anywhere in host file system. So we will see some, we won't go into details on how everything works in Docker, but you should know some theory so that you don't just pick a Docker file and spin up something. Instead, you should know a little bit of how Docker works and why we use, for example, volumes, why we, for example, use something else. If you want to scale up your app, you sometimes you want to separate into several Docker containers. So putting in everything into one Docker container, then it's similar to as you put in everything in one system, and it's becoming something called a monolith. You want to separate different systems and have loose coupling between them, so that you get higher scalability. It's simpler to scale. This we might come into later on in the future when building bigger systems. But for now, you need to know that there's a possibility to separate into several Docker containers. One example here, we will use it in this course. Here you have a Docker file. It builds a Docker image, and then you spin up a Docker container. You can create another Docker file and spin up another Docker container, and so on and so forth. You can get several different containers. So these containers could represent like Python container with packages. So this is one container. You could have one that is Postgres container because you don't want the database to be in the same container as your Python container. Then you have the Postgres port. You have the local host from the Postgres, the port, which you can connect your Python container with. So that is quite cool. Then they are talking to each other, even if they are not in the same system, basically, right? So you could have Apache Kafka in another container. You could have, and so on and so forth. So you can have several systems. Let's move on here. How many Docker files? Oh, actually, I should have started here. Arg, so many files to keep track of. Use Paperclip to put them together. Nah, we can use one master file instead. Something called Docker Compose. Okay, so multiple Docker containers using Docker Compose. So you have a file called Docker Compose YAML. From this, it will spin up a Docker container. It creates an image in a Docker container. Then it will create another image and another Docker container. The first one could be Python. The second one could be Postgres. And the third one could be Apache Kafka, and so on. From a file, you could specify several containers that you want, several services it's called. And with this, I would like to thank you for watching this video on multiple containers and using Docker Compose. You've also learned about the volumes, at least the theory about it, and we'll come into the code and try to understand what the Docker and Docker container is in the code sessions. Thank you. Bye.